Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Today I want to dive into something that doesn't always get the headlines it deserves here in the US, but it's hugely important for the future of the West, and honestly for America too. I'm talking about Europe. We keep hearing news about Europe, whether it's the war in Ukraine, trade disputes with the US, or political unrest in places like Britain, Germany, and France. But when you really start to dig deeper, you realize that Europe is facing a series of overlapping crises. And if we don't pay attention, we could miss how all of this is going to shape our world in the next decade. Now, I want to walk through these issues, step by step. We'll talk about immigration and social unrest, energy policy and Europe's push for net zero emissions, NATO and the security situation with Russia, and finally the question of whether Europe's welfare state model is sustainable. So buckle up. This is going to be a deep dive. Let's start with immigration and the unrest it's sparking. If you've been following the news, we've probably seen stories about protests in the UK. Just recently, we saw large demonstrations where people were angry about what they see as unequal treatment, the government handling illegal immigrants and crime differently than it handles ordinary British citizens. The frustration boils down to a sense of unfairness. Illegal immigrants often aren't prosecuted as harshly or as consistently as native citizens might be under the same laws. That creates a perception of double standards. And this isn't just a British story. Over in Germany, we're seeing major political shifts and pushback on immigration policies. Remember Angela Merkel's famous line back in 2015? She said, "Wir schaffen das." In English, "Yes, we can," referring to Germany's ability to welcome migrants from the Middle East, mostly Muslim migrants fleeing war zones. Germany ended up taking in around 1 million refugees. Today, around 15 to 16% of Germany's population is made up of people who are not citizens or who weren't born in Germany. That's a huge demographic shift in a short period of time, and the challenge is, integration hasn't gone smoothly. We've seen riots in the Netherlands too, and in France the situation has been even more dramatic. Think about the riots in France in 2023, when a police shooting of a teenager with immigrant roots triggered nationwide unrest. Entire neighborhoods burned, stores were looted, and the government had to send thousands of police into the streets. These events highlight the tension between immigrant communities and the broader society. Now, let me pause here and say this. Immigration is not inherently bad. In fact, immigration can strengthen economies, bring in younger workers to offset aging populations, and enrich culture. But the problem in Europe is that the influx has been so large and so fast that assimilation has struggled to keep up. And when you add in generous welfare benefits, you create resentment. Native citizens feel like their tax dollars are going to people who aren't fully contributing. That resentment is fueling the rise of populist parties across Europe, from Marine Le Pen in France to the Alternative for Germany, which just had record gains in regional elections. So many critics are right to highlight immigration as a major source of instability. But I also think their take is a little one-sided. Europe does need immigrants. Just look at the demographics. In Germany, for example, about 22% of the population is over the age of 65. Without younger immigrants joining the workforce, their pension and healthcare systems would collapse. So it's not as simple as immigration bad. The real challenge is how to balance the need for workers with the need for integration and social cohesion. All right, let's move on to the second big issue, energy. Europe has been leading the charge on climate policy for years. Many countries have pledged to hit net zero emissions by 2050, which means phasing out fossil fuels almost entirely. In practice, this has meant shutting down coal plants, scaling back oil and gas, and even, in Germany's case, shutting down nuclear power. The problem? Renewable energy hasn't been able to fully replace those reliable sources yet. So Europe finds itself stuck with high energy costs. If you've ever looked at electricity prices across countries, you'll know Europe's are sky high. In 2023, the average household electricity price in Germany was around 40 US cents per kilowatt hour. Compare that to about 15 cents in the US. And remember, California has some of the highest electricity prices in America. Even there, people were paying about 30 cents per kilowatt hour. So Germany's costs are even higher than California's. That's a huge disadvantage for both ordinary families and for businesses competing globally. This really came to a head after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Europe had been heavily reliant on Russian natural gas. About 40% of EU gas imports came from Russia before the war. When those supplies were cut off, Europe scrambled to find alternatives, importing liquefied natural gas from the US and Qatar. Prices spiked, factories shut down, and people literally couldn't afford to heat their homes in winter. In 2022, there were stories of German families cutting firewood for the first time in decades because heating costs were unaffordable. Now, do I think Europe made a mistake by pursuing green energy? Not entirely. Transitioning to cleaner energy is necessary in the long run. But what Europe did wrong, in my opinion, was trying to leak too far, too fast, without having a reliable backup. Shutting down nuclear plants, for instance, was a huge blunder. Nuclear is one of the cleanest and most reliable sources of power we have. France kept most of its nuclear plants running and has had a much easier time than Germany during the energy crisis. So yes, the critics is right that Europe's energy policies are hurting its competitiveness, but I would add that the real problem is poor planning and lack of balance. The third big issue is security, and here's where NATO comes in. For decades after World War II, the US carried the heavy load of defending Europe. Through the Marshall Plan, NATO, the Bretton Woods system, and institutions like the IMF and World Bank, America helped rebuild Europe and keep it safe from Soviet aggression. The deal was basically this: Europe could focus on economic recovery and social welfare, while the US provided military muscle and guaranteed open trade routes. That arrangement worked for a while, especially during the Cold War. But since the 1990s, Europe has often underinvested in its own defense. NATO has a guideline that members should spend at least 2% of GDP on defense. For years, only a handful of countries met that target. Germany, Europe's largest economy, was spending barely 1.2% of GDP on defense as recently as 2019. Meanwhile, the US was covering 16 to 18% of NATO's total budget. Donald Trump made this a huge talking point during his presidency. He pushed European leaders to step up, and he got hammered in the media for it. But guess what? Since Russia invaded Ukraine, NATO countries have started to get serious. As of 2024, about 22 or 23 member states are on track to hit that 2% target, and some, like Poland, are going even higher, pledging up to 5%. So Trump may have been controversial, but in hindsight, he was ahead of the curve. Now Europe faces the reality that war isn't something happening far away in Chechnya or Georgia. It's right on their doorstep in Ukraine, and it's forcing them to rethink decades of underspending. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz recently admitted that they can't afford to maintain a generous welfare state while also paying for defense and supporting millions of immigrants. That's a huge political shift. And that brings us to the fourth issue, the welfare state. Europe's model has always been about generous social benefits: healthcare, education, pensions, housing support, unemployment insurance, you name it. But this model only works if the economy is growing fast enough and the population is balanced between workers and retirees. Right now, Europe has neither. Growth is sluggish, populations are aging, and governments are drowning in debt. Add in the cost of supporting immigrants, many of whom take time to fully enter the workforce, and the system starts to strain. Take France as an example. The French government spends about 31% of its GDP on social welfare programs, one of the highest rates in the world. That's why raising the retirement age by just 2 years, from 62 to 64, sparked massive nationwide protests in 2023. People are deeply attached to their benefits. But the math just doesn't add up anymore. Germany faces a similar dilemma. They've welcomed millions of immigrants, many of whom are on welfare, while at the same time trying to fund a stronger military and cope with high energy prices. Merz's statement that we can't afford the welfare state anymore is shocking coming from a German leader, but it reflects a growing awareness that something has to give. Some critics argue that Europe's socialist model just doesn't produce enough goods and services to support such a broad welfare state. There's truth in that. Europe's growth has lagged behind the US for decades, but it's not just about socialism. It's also about demographics, globalization, and technological change. Europe has amazing companies. Think of Siemens, Airbus, or ASML in the Netherlands, which basically makes the world's most advanced semiconductor equipment. But those bright spots can't offset the drag of aging populations and rigid labor markets. So where does that leave us? The critic's prescription is pretty straightforward. Europe needs to get back to common-sense energy policies, embrace nuclear and natural gas, secure its borders, and only allow legal immigration, shrink the welfare state, and invest more in defense. And honestly, I agree with a lot of that. Europe does need cheaper energy, safer borders, and stronger militaries, but I'd also argue that Europe needs to think about the future, not just returning to the past. For instance, instead of just slashing welfare, Europe could reform it to make it more sustainable, tying benefits more closely to work or contribution. Instead of rejecting immigrants, Europe could focus on smarter immigration, bringing in skilled workers and creating better integration programs. And instead of seeing green energy as a burden, Europe could turn it into an opportunity to lead the world in clean tech. Because here's the reality. Europe isn't going away. It's still home to 500 million people, some of the world's largest economies, and a huge cultural influence. What happens in Europe affects us here in the US, whether it's through NATO, global markets, or shared democratic values. So the big question is, can Europe adapt? Can it balance its ideals with the harsh realities of today's world? To wrap this up, I'd say Europe is at a crossroads. Immigration, energy, defense, and welfare are all colliding at once. The easy years, where America paid for defense and Russia sold cheap gas, are over. Now Europe has to make tough choices. Some of those choices will be painful, closing budget gaps, cutting benefits, raising defense spending. But they're necessary if Europe wants to remain competitive and secure. As for us in the US, we should pay close attention, because a weak, unstable Europe isn't just their problem, it's ours too. NATO matters, trade matters, and if Europe collapses under its own contradictions, it'll drag down the whole Western world. So that's my deep dive for today. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment letting me know what you think. Do you agree that Europe's biggest problem is immigration? Or do you think energy or welfare is the real ticking time bomb? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.